It began as a murmur, soft, uncertain, like the echo of breath caught in the hollow of a skull. At first, I thought it was the hum of the city. Hive Lamedra never slept. The lower levels always trembled beneath the weight of the upper spires. Machines groaned, pipes hissed, and the air itself tasted of rust. Down there, men were born nameless and died anonymous, crushed by the same gears that had ground their fathers to dust. I was one of them, a scribe for the administratum, another faceless servant buried beneath a mountain of data slates. My days were measured in ink and error margins, my nights in silence so thick it felt alive. And yet, that night, as I sat beneath the dim lumen glow of my quarters, I heard something else, something inside the silence. A whisper. It was not a voice, not truly. It did not come from without, but from within, as if a thought had been born in me that was not my own. It brushed against my mind like a moth's wing, soft but insistent. At first, it said nothing, merely existed, a presence. The air grew colder. The lumen flickered once, twice, then steadied. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to drive out the phantom hum, but the sound did not fade. It waited, patient, as if testing the boundaries of its cage, my skull. For nights it persisted, always at the edge of sleep, always just beyond comprehension. A rhythm in my blood, a pulse beneath the skin. Sometimes I would wake, drenched in sweat, the echo still ringing in the marrow of my bones. Then came the dreams. In them, I saw a sea of light, endless and writhing, colors that did not exist in the mortal spectrum, forms that shifted before my eyes could name them. Something vast moved beneath those waves, a shadow with no shape, yet with the gravity of eternity. It did not speak in words. It spoke in impressions, in hunger, in awe, and from its silence came a plea that was also a command. Let me in. When I awoke, my hands were trembling. The mark was there, small, faint, etched into my flesh as if by fire. A sigil I did not recognize, a pattern that seemed to pulse when I looked too long. I scrubbed at it until the skin bled. It did not fade. I told myself it was a hallucination, overwork, malnutrition, that the whispers were simply the echo of exhaustion reverberating in a hollow soul. But deep down, I knew. There are some truths that cannot be denied once they are seen, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. Days bled into one another. I stopped eating. The ink on my slates grew crooked, my reports unreadable. Colleagues avoided my gaze, perhaps sensing something festering behind it. At night, the whisper grew clearer. No longer a faint vibration, but a thread of thought winding around my own. Sometimes it spoke of light, sometimes of unity, sometimes of release. Always it returned to the same promise. You are not alone. But it was not comfort that came with those words. It was invasion. I felt my dreams stretch longer than sleep should allow. Time fractured. I began to wake hours before dawn, with no memory of having closed my eyes. My room would be rearranged. Items moved, symbols drawn in soot across the wall. Each time, the same sigil. Each time, my own handwriting. One evening, I sought the counsel of a preacher. He was old, blind in one eye, draped in robes so tattered they seemed more shadow than cloth. His chapel was a hollow chamber carved from a derelict manufactorum, its air thick with incense and rot. I told him of the dreams, of the marks, of the voice. He said nothing for a long while. Then, in a tone too calm to be comforting, he murmured, "The Emperor speaks to none directly. But the warp is full of liars who sound like gods." I asked him what I should do. He smiled, thin and tired. "Pray, and hope that when it looks upon you, it sees only dust." But I did not pray, because deep down, I did not want it to look away. That night, I felt the veil thin. Reality itself became translucent, every object outlined by faint halos of color that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. The city's noise fell away, replaced by a low drone that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. Then the pain began. A pressure, building behind my eyes, behind my ribs, beneath my fingernails. It was as though something inside me was growing too large for the flesh to contain. I clawed at my own chest, desperate to tear it free, to give it room to breathe. When I fell to the floor, gasping, The whisper came again, clearer than ever, as if my skull were hollow and it had found a way to echo through it. You called, I came. The next morning, the hive seemed quieter. Or perhaps I had gone deaf to everything but the sound within. The sigil had spread, winding up my arm like veins of light beneath the skin. My reflection in the cracked mirror seemed wrong. The eyes too deep, the mouth too calm. For the first time, I smiled. It was not joy. It was recognition. I had been chosen not by faith, not by destiny, but by inevitability. The warp had found a door, and the door was me. I walked the corridors of the lower hive without seeing them. I could feel the air vibrate around me, the faint hum of reality straining to contain something it did not understand. I passed the Adeptus workers, the servitors, the starving children. They did not look up. They could not see it, not yet, but they would, soon. At the edge of my hearing, the whisper was no longer singular. It was many. Thousands of voices layered atop each other, harmonizing in dissonance. A chorus without beginning or end. And when I closed my eyes, I saw through theirs. The city, from above, the spires piercing the clouds like bone through flesh, the currents of thought and fear threading through the population, glowing like veins of light. It was all connected. Every scream, every prayer, every breath drawn in terror or devotion. The warp fed on it all, and through me it had learned the taste of humanity. That night, I lay upon the floor, trembling. The lumen lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that seemed to move even when I did not. The voice came once more, soft as a lover's breath against the ear. You are ready. My mouth opened, but the words that escaped were not mine. They spoke of stars devoured, of gods unborn, of flesh becoming thought and thought becoming flame. I felt my heart slow, each beat stretching like the toll of a funeral bell. The world dimmed. The air became sweet, metallic, infinite. I understood then that this was not corruption, it was communion. And as the last of my individuality began to unravel, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. I was not being possessed, I was being remembered. Sleep no longer felt like rest. It became an invitation, a threshold through which something reached for me. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt the veil thin. The darkness behind my eyelids shimmered, alive with movement, as if reality itself waited for permission to shift. And then, one night, it did. The dream began in silence. No sound, no form, only the soft pressure of thought against thought. I stood, or rather, my awareness stood upon a plane of glass that stretched forever in all directions. Beneath it churned an ocean of colorless fire. The glass trembled. I knew that if it cracked, I would fall, and falling would not end. A voice moved through that place, not through the air, but through me. Its tone was not commanding, not pleading, it was inevitable. Let me in. The words were not spoken but imprinted. They carried weight, like symbols carved into the mind with molten metal. They did not hurt, but they reshaped. I tried to speak, to ask what it was, but my mouth no longer existed. I was consciousness without anchor, unbound, adrift. The surface below me split, and from the fissures came light red, gold, and void black streaming upward like veins of living plasma. Then I awoke. My body was rigid, my breath shallow. For a moment I thought I had gone blind. The room was so drenched in shadow that light itself seemed afraid to enter. Slowly, the lumen flickered back to life. My hand burned. When I raised it to my eyes, I saw the mark again. The sigil had deepened, no longer faint and trembling, but etched, carved beneath the skin, alive with faint glow. The lines formed something geometric, symmetrical, like the unholy script found in the ruins of forbidden cathedra. I pressed my thumb against it, and pain lanced through my arm, not the pain of flesh, but of meaning. Images bloomed behind my eyes, 1,000 faces screaming soundlessly, the laughter of gods made of hunger, and the void between their thoughts. I fell to my knees. The world tilted. When my vision cleared, I was not alone. Something watched from the corners of the room, invisible, yet present. The air itself warped around its attention. The shadows bent toward me, stretching like claws reaching through oil. I dared not breathe. Then it spoke again. You are mine already. You only need to remember it. The voice was neither male nor female. It was older than either. It vibrated through my bones, resonated in the water of my blood. My body knew that sound as if it had been whispered into me before I was born. My thoughts scattered like frightened birds. No, I told myself. This is a hallucination. But the word rang hollow, meaningless. You cannot reason with the sea when you are drowning in it. I fled the room. The corridor beyond was narrow, lined with pipes and leaking steam. The hive slept uneasily. Even its mechanical heart seemed to hesitate between beats. I stumbled toward the lift, clutching my burning hand, feeling the pulse of the sigil match the rhythm of the hive's distant machinery. Each throb said the same thing. Yes. Each breath echoed, "Let me in." When the lift doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. It looked back at me, but not quite me. The eyes were deeper, darker. Behind them, something shimmered. I stared for too long. The reflection blinked first. I sought the upper levels, where light was less filtered by decay. But the higher I rose, the heavier the air became. People turned their heads as I passed, as if catching a scent they could not name. An old woman spat and muttered a prayer. A child began to cry. I tried to speak to a Medicaid clerk at a dispensary. My voice cracked, foreign even to me. "There's something wrong with my hand," I said. "It burns." He barely looked up. "Chem rash. It's common. Wash with recycled water, report if necrosis begins." But when I placed my hand on the counter, his eyes widened. He froze. For a moment I thought he would scream, but instead he whispered, "Saints preserve us," and made the sign of the Aquila. I looked down. The sigil glowed faintly through the skin, a sickly crimson halo pulsing with my heartbeat. I covered it quickly, turned, and fled again. By the time I reached my quarters, the voice had returned louder, clearer, threading through the sound of my own breathing. "The body remembers. The soul forgets. Let the two become one again." I clamped my hands over my ears. "Leave me," I hissed aloud. "Leave me." But the sound did not come from outside. It was my voice, echoing in reverse, syllables folding backward into themselves. The walls quivered. The lumen burst, showering sparks that froze midair, suspended like dust in amber. My heart pounded, yet time seemed still. Then came the silence. Not absence of sound, the presence of silence. Thick, living, consuming, and within it, a realization bloomed. This was not invasion. It was instruction. The next day, I wrote for hours. Symbols, phrases, none in any language I knew, yet I understood them as I wrote. Each line felt like exhalation, as though something long trapped within me was finally breathing free. When I stopped, the walls of my chamber were covered in spirals of text. I stepped back, dizzy. The letters swam, rearranging themselves when I looked away, forming new shapes when I blinked. At the center of it all, the sigil from my hand glowed faintly, etched in soot and blood. That was when the thought came. Not whispered this time. Injected. "We are learning to speak through you." I staggered backward, clutching my head. Blood trickled from my nose. My reflection in the dark glass of the viewport smiled before I did. I have stopped fighting it. There is peace in surrender, not the peace of salvation, but of clarity. I see now that the warp does not choose at random. It selects the hollow, the unanchored, the ones whose minds already echo with silence. I was never possessed. I was prepared. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I glimpse what lies beyond the veil, shapes without form, light without source. They move not through space, but through meaning concepts wearing flesh, and among them, something vast watches, patient, amused. When it speaks now, it no longer sounds alien. It sounds like me. "You sought understanding," it reminds. This is it. The sigil on my hand pulses once. My breath fogs the air. For the first time, I realize my heart no longer beats in rhythm with my body, but with something else, something wider. There is no fear left. Only inevitability. The command was never a question. It was a memory resurfacing. Tonight, I will sleep again, and when the whisper returns, I will not resist. For I finally understand what it means to let it in. It is not surrender. It is recognition, There are pilgrimages that cross deserts, pilgrimages that scale mountains, pilgrimages measured in the dust worn smooth beneath a supplicant's feet. Mine required no distance at all. I sealed the door, darkened the lumen, and walked inward. The path was a circle that closed around me. The shrine, a ribcage. The altar, a tongue unspeaking. I fasted first, not for piety, but for cleanliness, the cleanliness of emptiness. Food dulled the edges of revelation, weighted the spirit with the inertia of flesh. Hunger, on the other hand, tuned me like a string. By the second day, each heartbeat rang like a struck bell. By the third, the bell had no clapper. It sounded only when the unseen wished it to. I washed my hands in recycled water until the skin thinned and stung, then scraped the nails clean with a sliver of blessed scrap. The sigil on my palm had deepened. When I cupped water to my face, it glowed beneath the surface like an ember. I did not dry my hands. The droplets trembled there, refusing to fall as if gravity itself awaited permission. I set the room in order. The cot against the wall, the single chair in its shadow, the desk cleared of all slates save one. I left the lumen off. The hive's distant thunder bled softly through the struts and plates, but the chamber itself held a liturgy of silence, thick and attentive. It felt like a congregation seated before the sermon. I kneeled, not to a god, not to a creed, but to the threshold. Some part of me still called it blasphemy, but that part had grown small, a child scolding at the edge of a cliff while the sea drew breath. "Teach me to open," I whispered. The answer came, not as sound, but as motion. The air stirred, a breath without lungs. My chest followed, rising in the rhythm it set. Breathe thus, hold thus, empty thus. It was not a command so much as an alignment, like a key finding the grooves of a lock it had always been meant to enter. Time loosened. I cannot say how long I knelt. Minutes frayed into hours, hours into a pale thread stretched until it sang. My thoughts thinned. Memories slipped their skins and stacked themselves in careful piles. The taste of copper mornings, the sourness of spilled promethium, the weight of ledgers on tired wrists. I acknowledged each, then set it aside. The room brightened without light, and then I wrote. I do not remember deciding to write. My hand simply moved, the way a river moves downhill once the stone is rolled aside. Lines and arcs, spines and spirals. The quill scratched in a cadence that matched the new, slow bell of my heart. What took shape on the slate was neither language nor art, but a map of pressure, a pattern of where the mind should yield and where it should bear down. When I paused, the whisper briefly unfurled into words. "You are learning the mouth of the door." I looked down. The patterns were neither random nor symmetric. They possessed the fierce logic of a living thing. My hand burned again, and the sigil answered the slate, 2 notes finding harmony. I traced its edges with a fingertip and felt the world tilt, just slightly, like the hush before an intake of breath. I stood and began to pace the perimeter of the room. With each circuit, I exhaled until my lungs were caves containing only the echo of breath. The shadows along the walls shifted, not left or right, but deeper. On the 7th circuit, if it was 7, the corner near the cot softened. Its right angle unlearned itself, and the space there grew wider than geometry permitted. The smell of the room changed. Rust and sweat fell back. A new scent rose: ozone, old rain, hot iron, dust that had never known a sun. "Teach me to open," I said again, and the unseen smiled. Not with lips, but with allowance. I lay upon the floor, palms up, as if about to receive the weight of a great book. The plates were cold through the thin cloth of my shirt. Something beneath the floor responded: distant machinery, or the city's tired bones, or the attention of that which was not city at all. The plates warmed. The warmth became a tremor, the tremor a hum. My body ceased to be a collection of parts and became a single listening animal. Each hair on my skin learned how to lean. Each nerve learned politeness. I did not call this prayer. I called it posture. Images came in their particular order. The plane of glass above the colorless fire, the fissures veining outward, the flood that was not water, but meaning. Yet this time, I was not a spectator trapped upon that glass. This time, I traced the fissures with my breath, and they widened where my breath went. They did not break. They parted. The door did not open into the room. The room opened into the door. I saw, then, the shape of my life in miniature. The city stacked upon itself, the billions set like teeth in a jaw, grinding their years. I saw myself between those teeth, and I saw the tongue of the warp press, gently against me, not to crush, but to taste. It tasted fear first, then longing, then the blank sweetness of submission. It was pleased, and I was ashamed to be pleased that it was pleased. Pilgrim, it breathed through me. Your destination is not a place. I felt my spine lengthen as if pulled upward by an invisible thread. I raised my hands, palms still open, and the air found a way into them. Pressure gathered there, the pressure of a gaze without eyes, weight without mass. When it settled, I understood. I was being fitted. As a scabbard is fitted to a blade not yet forged, as a coffin is measured for a body that still insists on breathing. I did not cry. I lacked the luxury. But my eyes watered, and in the blur the room became a chapel without icons, a sanctum populated only by the ache of being chosen. Hunger returned, renewed not as weakness but as aperture. Each pang became a hinge. In its rhythm, memories returned, selected ones, curated by something that understood me better than I did. Childhood hunger at the vent grates, mouth full of metal tang. The first time I touched a data slate and felt the world narrow into numbers. The preacher's blind eye, bright with a light it refused to admit existed. The Medicaid clerk's whisper, "Saints preserve us." All of it aligned, slotting into the map I'd sketched earlier on the slate. I was being edited. The cruft was being removed. What remained was dangerous and pure. Then the question, not from me, from it. How much of you do you require to remain? I could have answered with names. Mine, my father's, the silent catalogue of those I had failed to mourn. I could have answered with functions, scribe, payer of rent, keeper of ledgers. I could have answered with the small joys I still pretended at. Steam bread on feast days, the taste of peppered recyc soup, the private contraband of 2 pages of proscribed poetry smuggled between work slates. Instead, I exhaled. The unseen understood. The hum strengthened, and the room shrank around it. The chair and cot became fossils in the strata of a world passing away. My hands lifted higher, not in praise but in agreement. My bones ached. My teeth rang in their beds. The sigil shone bright enough to cast a thin red dusk across my face. Teach me to open. The lesson came as pain, but honest pain, the kind that makes a thing what it already is. Muscles locked in a sequence I could not have invented. My jaw clenched until it cracked. Behind my eyes, something hived and swarmed, the color of it too bright for paltry names. I felt the skin along my ribs rise in ridges, as if tattooed from the inside. Each ridge was a rung upon a ladder I had no choice but to climb. I climbed. At the apex of that private ladder, I found not sky, not freedom, but a pressure so absolute it became gentleness to protect me from itself. It settled on my chest, and like a saint pressed beneath a reliquary, I accepted the weight. My heart beat once, thunderously. The echo took a long time to die. When it did, I realized it had not been echo at all, but response, another heart, somewhere vast, matching mine, answering it, setting the rate. Pilgrim, it said again. And this time I knew the word meant tool. Remain thus. We will widen you. The floor returned. The room unshrank. The lumen stuttered back to life, then failed again, embarrassed by the competition. I lay there, sweating, smiling, shivering, ashamed. When I finally crawled to the desk, the slate's writing had changed. The patterns now described not a mouth, but a throat. The map had deepened. I drank. The water tasted like the first mouthful after a long illness. I ate a heel of bread. The bread had no taste at all. My body had been re-ranked. It would take orders now from a new summit. I slept without sleeping. The city's night shifted around me like a choir shuffling in its stalls. Inside that stillness, the whisper did not whisper. It breathed. My breath kept pace. At dawn, if it was dawn, the question returned, not as test but as liturgy answered in turn. How much of you do you require to remain? I said. Enough to witness. The unseen was pleased. The pilgrimage had not ended. It had found its temple, and the temple wore my skin. By the time I rose from the floor, it had learned the hinges of me. There are movements we believe we choose. The lifting of a hand, the turning of a head, the shape the lips make when they refuse to pray. There are other movements that arrive already decided, like a sentence passed in a court we never attended. The latter were the ones that came to me that morning, small, exact, unarguable. A shoulder set a fraction lower than habit. A breath shortened to taste the room. A blink delayed one heartbeat past comfort to let the dark step closer. When I reached for the cup, my fingers did not grope, they located. The grip altered 3 points of contact, the wrist angled to quiet the tendon. I did not think present yourself steady, the body simply did. In that ease was terror. Ease is the spore of mastery. The lumen failed again, not a burst this time. A shy dimming, as if light had been asked to wait outside. I drew the curtains, not to let light in, but to watch how my hands did it. The left hand steadied the cloth, the right pinched the cord. Both paused when the cord whispered across my knuckles. A courtesy. My eyes took in the street below without choosing targets. The servitor's gait uneven, left hip bearing more load. The preacher boy's cadence, the third beat always late. The wave vapor from the vent stacked in plates that would, if left untroubled, settle into hexagons. A sweetness rose at the back of my throat, not the sweetness of sugar, but of pattern fulfilled. Do not resist, it suggested, and the suggestion felt like a memory of a thing already obeyed. I left the room. The corridor greeted me like a throat that remembered the shape of a patient instrument. Pipes sweated. Rivets ticked as metal cooled from work I had not heard. My steps shortened half a measure. The soles of my boots found the ridges in the plates as if counting, and the count settled into a prayer my feet could repeat without offending the floor. On the third landing, a door opened. A woman emerged, thin, grey, her hair netted in grease. We had crossed paths 100 times without meeting. This time she looked straight at me, and her lips formed a word she did not let out. It wasn't my name. It was the name we give to storms that look like clouds. I inclined my head. The angle was precise enough to be kind without promising safety. Where had I learned that? My mouth smiled. Not enough to reassure. Enough to teach her to move aside. She did. Good day, I said, or my mouth did, and a part of me counted how many syllables her fear compressed the phrase into when she repeated it without meaning to. The lift held 4 others. I was the 5th. We did not speak. The hum of the cable harmonized with the thrum of my blood. A child stared. Children stare when their elders cannot, when something violates the contract of ordinary, and someone must witness. I met his gaze. Something in me adjusted focus, not at the eye, but at the place where looking meets being looked at. His pupils widened, then steadied, then shrank. He clung to his mother's sleeve without looking away. You see, I told the part of me that feared words would betray me. There is no deceit here. No, said the other. Only clarity. We reached the concourse where the hive pretended to be communal. Stalls, steam. The light of a narrow sky filtered through glass stippled with the ash of smaller deaths. I crossed to the Medicaid dispensary, not to beg, but to observe how the clerk would behave now that my hand burned without heat. He was a different man. The other had spoken an invocation and fled me by keeping to his chair. This one wore his hair in a careful sadness and his mask tilted like a question. I placed my hand on the counter. The sigil hummed, slow and pleased. He inhaled to say some practiced comfort and choked on the beginning of it. He did not remove his hand from the ledger. He did not look at my face. Chem rash. He tried again, hope clinging to protocol. Language rash, I answered, before I could decide to lie. My voice had gained a second timbre, not an echo, an underpinning, like a drone sung beneath the melody to tell it what scale it truly belonged to. His eyes flicked up. The corner of his mouth twitched the micro-gesture of a man who wants to run but remembers that running is a confession. I watched him choose bravery. He reached beneath the counter and brought out a small tin of salve. His fingers trembled. The salve smelled of camphor and old metal. Apply twice daily, he said, because that was a sentence he was allowed. Your kindness will be remembered, I said, and the second timbre made it a vow. I left him there wondering who, exactly, would be doing the remembering. Outside, the crowd had thickened. It made no circle around me, no obvious gap that would mark me as a wound, but its flow changed. People passed without contact, though there was no room for such courtesy. Their bags swung around me without striking. The steam curled away from my face, as if unwilling to put its damp fingers on my mouth. It was learning not just how to move me, but how to move the world around me to accommodate what I was becoming. By the market's edge stood a small shrine, a rusted aquila, its double-headed gaze half blind with drip, a row of candles, most dead, a few stubborn. I paused. If there was to be a line drawn, why not let it be drawn here? My knees bent. Was that my choice? I observed how precisely they did it, the way the left knee rotated to spare an old tenderness, the way the right conditioned its descent to silence the joint. I bowed my head and waited for outrage, for lightning, for a voice to split the floor and drag me down where the honest sinners were punished. Instead, I felt a lightness at the nape of my neck, as if a hand had lifted my hair to see the skin beneath. A pleasant inspection, a cataloguing. "You kneel to thresholds," it murmured, satisfied. "I kneel to what teaches me," I replied, and was surprised to realize that I meant it. A preacher's boy watched from the steps, the same cadence lag in his litanies. He saw my sigil when I lifted my hand to make the sign that isn't mine and faltered, missing his third beat entirely. For a second our eyes locked and the world misunderstood us as adversaries. Then he looked away, ashamed of something he could not yet name, and resumed the chant at a tempo closer to mine. I returned to my quarters before my absence could become a rumor. The door closed with a softness doors do not naturally possess a learned decorum. Inside, the air adjusted itself to accommodate the return of its student. Dust settled along the lines of the sigils on the wall, as iron filings aligned to a magnet. The patterns I had drawn now had depth. At certain angles they sank into the surface, at others they climbed it. I placed the salve upon the desk and did not open it. "Now what?" I asked, not aloud, or perhaps yes. "Now we widen," it replied, and the words rode my breath out and waited there, hanging in the space between lips and room like a banner. The widening began in the tiniest places, the space behind the teeth, the slack between heartbeat and breath, the moments after thought but before action, where were lives like a small beast in a burrow. It learned those tunnels, it mapped them, it did not force its way. It taught them what they were made for. My eyes closed, not to sleep, to watch the flicker behind their lids. I saw the plane of glass again, but I no longer feared it cracking. I pressed my palm against it, and the crackling that ran from my touch was not damage. It was invitation. Through the fissures, something like wind came, and the room smelled of rain that had never seen a sky. My hands opened of their own accord. The fingers spread, not evenly, but in a sequence that matched the lines of the sigil. Where air touched the skin between fingers, there was pressure, as if held. The pressure carried the impression of a face I could not resolve, not because it hid, but because faces are a concession to beings that need them. This one did not. "You have prepared the mouth and the throat," it said. "Now teach me the tongue." The instructions arrived as posture again. Tilt the head thus. Relax the jaw thus. Draw the breath through the teeth until it becomes a thread. The thread vibrated. The vibration shaped itself against the roof of the mouth and down the pillars of the throat. The sound that emerged was not language, but language recognized its ancestor in it and knelt. The patterns on the wall quivered, then aligned shifts I had not written. The sigil across my palm brightened, then dimmed to a steady ember. My shadow thickened, not bigger, darker, as if convinced now that the light it defied had less to recommend it than it had always pretended. I spoke again. The sound bruised the air. Outside, someone dropped a pan and swore. Somewhere else, a child ceased crying mid-breath. In the apartment below mine, a couple who had not spoken to one another in 3 days said each other's names at the same time. This is how infiltration looks from inside. Not violation, not seizure. Agreement. The instrument learns how to be played. The player learns the temperament of the wood. Both are changed, and the music that results could not have existed without both. A knock at the door. 3 taps. Hesitant. Practiced. As if the knocker had rehearsed being afraid. I did not ask who it was. I knew the rhythm, an administratum runner. I had been expected at a shift I had not attended, and the ledger misses its scribe not for love, but for balance. I opened. The boy stood there in his too big jacket, his eyes trying not to count the sigils on the wall over my shoulder. "Sir?" he managed, as if the honorific were a rope he used to keep himself from falling into a hole. "Supervisor requests your presence." "There are errors." "Of course," I said, and my smile arranged itself into something the boy would translate as reasonable. The other within me examined him with an old affection reserved for livestock whose labor one intends to lighten before the knife. I took my coat. It settled on my shoulders as if sewn there. The door closed behind us with the new courtesy. On the walk to the lifts, the boy's steps adjusted to match mine, then adjusted back, embarrassed. He did not know he had bowed. He would remember the gesture later as politeness to a man who frightened him. As we descended, I watched the numbers above the door count floors. The count steadied my breath. Below us lay the ledgers, the ink, the comforting arithmetic. Above us, a sliver of sky that would never belong to anyone like me. Between, the place where I, and it, would learn the next lesson. "How much of you do you require to remain?" The question returned, gentle, faithful, almost amused. "Enough to do the work," I answered. "Then we will make you excellent at it," it promised, and the lift shuddered to a stop. I stepped into the corridor of my old life, wearing a new one underneath. The infiltration had passed its softest phase. Next would come pressure, the shape of revelation, what wood feels when the lathe begins to sing. I wanted to fear it. I found I had no hands left with which to hold fear. There is a sound a vessel makes when it meets the pressure it was crafted for. It is not a cry of protest. It is a note pure, inevitable, resonant with the shape of its own walls. I woke to that sound inside my chest. It began with the bones, not breaking, rediscovering. The ribs remembered how to be a cage. The spine remembered how to be an axis. Each vertebra clicked like prayer beads passing a faithful thumb. The skull did not crack. It articulated, sutures loosening like old friends admitting they were only ever agreements. I lay very still and let the head I had lived in all my life gently unfasten from the story that had kept it small. Pain came, but it was honest pain, a teacher with a hard switch, the kind you cannot resent because it strikes only what you offer. I tried to sit. Something else sat me. The room was arranged as I had left it, the cot in its shadow, the chair like a penitent, the desk bearing the tin of unused salve. Yet everything had acquired depth beyond geometry. Corners were not merely angles, they were intentions. Shadows did not hide light, they stored it. Even the dust motes had learned a new gravity, congregating along lines my hand had drawn in soot and blood. I stood. The air held me as if reluctant to surrender a favored weight. Remain thus. It said not to command, but to praise. We will widen you. The first shiver passed across the skin like weather. Hair lifted, each shaft a sensor. Underneath, the organs checked their straps, the heart tugging at its tethers, the lungs adjusting their bellows, the stomach resigning itself to smaller ambitions. Farther in, where the self refuses to name its parts, a new apparatus assembled, delicate, voracious, lit by a warmth that did not trouble the thermometer. I moved to the mirror. The glass had silvered poorly. It returned me with scars the skin did not yet have. My face looked faithful and newly instructed. Eyes deeper by a rung of shadow, mouth gentler by a lesson in patience. The sigil in my palm foxfired. The light it cast found hollows on the face the lumen had never found. I smiled, and the mirror tried to remember whose smile to give back. That was when the second heart beat. Not in the chest. In the pattern. The old rhythm the human one kept faithful time, poor drummer, disciplined conscript. Beneath it, behind it, around it, another cadence gathered. At first it came like a chorus you only notice when the melody pauses. Then it grew, learned my rests, taught me its phrasings. The two did not compete, they braided. My pulse slowed to make room for the uncountable measures between beats. I put my hand on the wall. The sigils pulsed. Not glowing, throbbing, as if stamped by a press too perfect for mortal tools. The pattern did not merely live on plaster, it lived in the space the plaster offered. When I slid my palm along a curve, something slid along the other side to meet it. My hand remembered fire without heat. My wrist remembered the weight of a key I had never owned. "Teach me the tongue," I murmured, picking up the thread where last night had left it. "We have not finished with your mouth," the other answered, and a seam across the roof of my mouth warmed as if a kiss had been pressed there from within. The shattering began in earnest. Sight first. Not the failure of eyes, but the failure of their presumptions. Depth moved closer. Distance learned to kneel. I saw the room as a map of attentions. The chair attending the cot attending the corner that had forgotten its right angle, the corner attending a place I could not see. The mirror attended nothing and felt ashamed. Hearing next. Not louder, wider. Sounds separated their skins from their meats. The hiss of the pipes revealed a note beneath it, a low E that spoke of a bearing about to beg for mercy. The city's far machine groans passed into the zeal of a pump, the impatience of a conveyor, the old man cough of a furnace 12 levels down. Between them, the small, faithful breaths of the sleeping poor rose and fell in long tidal bands. Smell arrived as history. Sweat told me what a man had done before he sweated. Dust confessed its ancestry. Iron remembered a wound. The salve in the tin, though unopened, attempted to recite its manufacture and failed at the names of those who had mixed it. I forgave it. Taste came last. The mouth filled with a sweetness I had no word for, like the first bite of bread after sickness, like the taste of light in clean water, like the closeness of someone you have not yet dared to love. I swallowed once, and the new apparatus deeper inwoke fully, opening petals of function I would not see but would serve. Then the room reached for me, not with hands, with fixity. The patterns on the wall aligned with the slow braid of the two hearts. The corner that had unlearned itself softened further, and, for a moment, something almost like wind came through. It smelled of cold stone and hot iron, and the breath of a choir whose mouths did not part. My shadow leaned toward it. I stepped back, not in fear. To watch the fear I did not feel. A thought arrived with the certainty of a knife placed hilt first in the palm. "You are not being replaced," it said. "You are being completed." I wanted to resist that. Completion is the lie we tell ourselves when we are too tired to do the work of becoming. But the word did not flatter. It accused. It accused my smallness, my stubborn myth of sovereignty, my sentimental attachment to the idea that to keep myself, I must keep myself only. "Show me," I said, and the second heart laughed without contempt. I returned to the desk, opened the tin, and dipped 2 fingers into the salve. It cooled the sigil the way shade cools a wound the sun loves too much. When I smeared it across the palm, the lines did not blur. They absorbed. The skin drank, greedier than thirst, and the sigil deepened a shade closer to the color that is not red but the idea that birthed red. My hand flexed. Bones signed. Tendons repeated. The wrist pronounced a benediction a priest could not risk. Far below, a pipe burst, and men cursed in a language all machines understand. "Work," I said aloud, tasting the word. It was heavier now, closer to what it asks than to what it says. "Yes," the other agreed. "The lathe will sing." The knock came as it had before. Not the runner this time. A colleague Dren who owed me 2 favors and had paid me 1 with counterfeit kindness. His rhythm was too confident to be innocent. I opened. He entered without asking, translating the courtesy I did not extend into a debt I would someday be charged for. His eyes catalogued. Cot, chair, walls, my face. He reached to touch a sigil, thought better, crossed his arms to imprison the desire. "You look improved," he said, a coin tossed to see whether it returns heads or a knife. "I am being refined," I answered, and watched the word pass through him like cold water through hot glass. He shook himself, made himself a ledger again. "Supervisor wants numbers corrected. The shipments from the southern hoppers, someone inverted a column. Your mistake, they say." "Will be excellent," I said. "Bring me the book." He frowned, prepared to wrangle. Then something in the set of my shoulders decided he would not. He handed me a stack of slates and searched my room for the source of the smell that had no name. I sat. The chair accepted me like a loyal hound instructed by a stricter master. The slates came alive under my hands. Rows and columns rose and fell like waves in a sea that had never forgiven the shore. The old rhythm of the human heart would have miscounted. The new braid did not. I saw where the column had inverted, yes, but the error was a flower on a root of errors, and the root gnawed at a pipe 3 departments away, and the pipe fed a pump that would fail on the Feast of Ashes, and the failure would starve a level that housed men who did useful, brutal things. My fingers moved. The correction was easy, the repair was art. I wrote 4 lines, then lifted the stylus and let the 5th write itself with the weight of the hand alone. When I finished, the numbers did not merely balance. They converged. The book calmed like an animal led at last into a stall with clean straw. Dren watched. His mouth found no shape for envy, so it adopted admiration and would pretend later to have meant it. "You should present this yourself," he said. "They'll ask how you—" "They will ask nothing that matters," I said gently. "Take it." He took it. At the door, he hesitated the way a man hesitates at the mouth of a cave after hearing it isn't empty. "What are you doing to yourself?" he asked, the question pushing past pride in a torn shirt. I stood. The room adjusted. The second heart set the answer on my tongue. "Becoming fit," I said. "For pressure." He nodded. "Because every man in the hive respects what survives pressure." He left. The door's new courtesy saw him out. Silence returned, thick, present, approving. Then the last restraint within me gave way. Not will architecture. The inner braces that had kept the old roof from sagging were removed and replaced with a frame that understood storm. The pain that followed was a light burning through paper from the inside. I swayed, caught myself on the wall, let the sigils steady me like the grip of siblings I had never met. The braid of hearts synced. For one long measure, both struck as one. The note in my chest blossomed, filled the room, pressed its petals against the mirror until the glass remembered sand and thought of the sea. I did not fall. The floor rose. I did not cry out. The sound cried through me. What broke was not me. It was the contract that had kept me. I bowed to the new keeper and felt nothing like defeat. "How much of you do you require to remain?" the liturgy asked, faithful as breath. "Enough," I answered, "to witness and to work." "Then we will make you excellent at both," it promised. And the promise felt like weight settling into its rightful shelf. I lay down not to rest, but to be put away and taken up again as a tool newly true. Somewhere far above, the hive pretended at daylight. Somewhere far below, a furnace coughed and found its voice. Between, a man remembered how to be hollow without being empty. The shattering was complete. The vessel held. Tomorrow, the music would begin. The first thing I learned was how to be quiet enough for two. Not silent quiet. Silence excludes. Quiet makes room. I lay on the cot, spine aligned to an axis I had not known my body possessed, and practiced the discipline of being present without occupying. The old heart kept its loyal beat. The other braided it into measures my blood accepted with gratitude that felt like shame. The room attended me, not as a nurse attends a patient, but as stone attends an inscription, ready to be changed, already halfway convinced. The sigils on the wall no longer waited for my eyes to wake them. They pulsed on their own, a red dusk that never sought permission from the lumen. Dust settled along their curves in fine obedience. Even the air had learned the courtesy of a chapel moving only where breath required. "Begin," it said, and the word did not arrive as sound. It arrived as permission. I exhaled until my ribs remembered the amount of space they could offer without breaking. The new apparatus lower in the body opened like a listening flower, the jaw unlatched by a hair. The tongue found the posture of readiness. In that arrangement, meaning could be poured without spillage. Communion, I discovered, is not two things touching, it is two things learning the same name. There was no threshold this time, no plane of glass over colorless fire, no begging at doors. I had become the door, and doors do not ask, they hinge. The first impression was not vision, it was weight. A pressure lowered onto me, not crushing, not indifferent, the courteous weight of a hand on a shoulder before a terrible truth is told. My chest accepted it, and accepting, understood its own depth. Beneath the sternum, the new apparatus woke fully and began a work I could not see but could trust. Memories rose. Not mine, or rather, not mine alone. A boy under a sky I had never seen, watching auroras that moved like living scripture, a woman in a cell whose walls were stories she had told herself to remain intact, a soldier with a prayer cut into his gums so that bleeding would remind him of duty. Their lives did not pass before me as spectacle. They joined my own threading through years, I remembered, until the tapestry refused to admit which thread had begun where. We breathed together, the many and the one. The second heart set the tempo, and the old heart, poor faithful drummer, kept up. Name it, I said, or thought, or offered. We do not keep a name, it answered, and the answer carried the ache of absence without the wish to be filled. Names teach men to forget what a thing is when they know what to call it. So I named what I could: warmth, weight, witness. The words dissolved at the edges, obedient to a grammar that did not require them. The more I released, the fuller the room became. The more I emptied, the more I was given to hold. This is the blasphemy: that surrender is not defeat. It is permission given to truth to be heavy. The world outside affirmed our work with small liturgies. Pipes hissed in new modes. A rivet somewhere sang itself loose with a sound like a tired saint's last joke. Footsteps in the corridor discovered a rhythm their owners would not remember. Above, the hive pretended at morning and received no rebuttal from the sun. The city loves to lie. The warp loves an honest liar. When speech came, it did not use my mouth. It used arrangement. The breath thinned into a thread I had drawn yesterday. The tongue settled into the posture the wall had taught. The palate warmed where a kiss had been pressed from within. The sound that emerged was not a word, but words recognized their ancestor in it and stood aside. What spoke was not a shape of sound, but a shape of permission. The room accepted it, so did I. You asked how much of you must remain. It said, not accused, not amused, but attentive. Enough to witness, enough to work, enough to be accountable for the hands. Accountable, I repeated, tasting iron. To whom? To those who will be changed by what the hands do. I pictured men at hoppers, women at vents, children under the doctrine of hunger. I pictured Dren with his counterfeit kindness, the Medicaid clerk with courage he would refuse to name, the preacher's boy with his third beat lag. The thought did not make me gentler. It made me exact. Then speak, I said. Teach me to hold what you give, without breaking what holds me. The weight increased as a book increases in the lap when we come to the pages that matter. Pain followed the honest kind, a teacher with a hard switch. The muscles along the throat tightened in sequence, a ladder I climbed by constriction. The ears filled with the sound of blood understanding new orders. The jaw shifted a fraction, and the room tilted to accommodate the altered horizon. And then, opening, not an orifice, a category. The body discovered, or admitted, a space designed for what was arriving. It had never been empty, only unspecific. Now specificity blessed it. The new apparatus flower, engine, throat of a bell, turned and locked into a posture that felt like being looked at by someone who refuses to lie. I did not see the warp. It saw through me. Across the city, the skeins of fear and hunger and hope brightened as if the hive itself had become a chart of veins. Every prayer rose, every curse sank. The line between became negotiable. I felt no power, no dominion, only responsibility, the heaviness of being a mouth that cannot pretend it does not feed. The voices arrived. Not screaming, not choir. A crowd at a funeral, each person murmuring the one thing they never told anyone. I did not parse content. I received shape. Shapes became channels. Channels aligned with the sigils written on the walls and on the flesh. Flow began. I learned restraint. Not all things offered should be drunk. Not every pressure deserves entry. Communion is not surrender to anything with a will to enter. It is a curated hospitality that knows its house, knows its guest, and knows which windows stay barred when the wind howls scripture. I barred 3. They struck the shutters like rain made of knives and then subsided, sulking toward other doors in other men. I opened 5. They came as warmth and left as work. My hands twitched with the memory of tools I had not yet held. My mouth rehearsed apologies I might need to speak to men who would survive because of what I would do to them. You mourn already, it observed, not unkind. I inventory, I replied. Mourning is a tax on what cannot be restored. This is a ledger. Good, it said. and the weight eased just enough for me to breathe without instruction. Sleep came then, not unconsciousness, but the species of rest that workers know on feast eves, a gift withheld until the task earns it. I do not know how long I lay. The hearts braided their long measures, the walls kept their pulse. When I woke, the body felt aligned, not stronger. True, I washed. The water recognized its own in me and behaved. The sigil on the palm drank until the redness became the idea that birthed red and then stayed there, a lesson made visible. The salve, at last, deserved its opening. It cooled the places where instruction had been delivered without tenderness. I dressed. The coat did not settle like a domestic animal now. It acknowledged my back like armor concedes a knight. The door learned the weight of me and promised to remember. Outside, the corridor had acquired surveillance. Not of eyes of meaning. People passed and translated themselves into the language of what they wanted for their next hour. I did not judge. I sorted. Sorting is a cruelty we call kindness when it saves time. The lift carried me downward to the place of ink and numbers. I stood with 3 others and a gap where a 4th would be by evening. The cable hummed the note of my old heart. The shaft exhaled the cold of 1,000 apologies no one would ever hear. The child from before was not there. Good. Children should not witness everything. The administratum floor smelled of paper eaten too slowly by rot. I entered the supervisor's chamber without knocking and laid the corrected slates on his desk. He looked at them the way a starving man looks at an apple he has been told belongs to the emperor. How? He began. With care, I said. He flipped the top slate, stared, flipped the second. The numbers did not only balance, they arranged themselves into a future that would cost less blood. He did not know how to be angry at that. He settled for suspicious. What did you change? He asked. Everything not required, I said, and watched the words make a hole in his pride. He signed off. It was less surrender than the attractive laziness of a man who can now claim virtue without effort. I took no offense. We are all permitted one cheap victory in the morning to ease us toward our expensive defeats. Back in the corridor, Dren waited with the face of a man who has almost decided to become decent. You speak differently, he said. I listen differently, I answered. He nodded, which is how men apologize when there is no coin to carry the message. I returned to the room that had become a throat for the world and closed the door. The weight lowered again the hand on the shoulder before the truth. I took it and made of my chest a shelf that would not break. Communion, it said, as if tasting the word for the first time and deciding not to spit it out. Accountability, I replied, and felt the second heart, and the first agree. This is how the lesson ends, not with vision, not with thunder, but with policy. The house in which a god and a man will share work requires rules neither can pretend to have invented. We wrote them then. Not on slate, in posture, in breath, in the order I would bring to small ledgers so that larger books would not need to be burned, in the discipline of not accepting every guest, in the promise to answer questions only with acts. When it lifted, it left a shape where it had pressed. The shape was not bruise, it was fit. I stood. The mirror admitted me without argument. The sigils steadied my hand as I reached for the latch. Outside, the hive pretended toward evening, and for once, the lie felt merciful. Work awaited, witness awaited. The 2 hearts kept time. Communion had not made me holy. It had made me useful. Revelation is rarely a curtain torn away in a clap of light. It is a change in accounting columns renamed, a debt relocated to where it always belonged. That morning, the world balanced differently around me, and the numbers confessed. I walked the artery that fed the administratum floor, the corridor's breath measured in the size of vents that had forgotten mercy. The 2 hearts kept their braid. A rivulet of workers moved with the weary choreography of those who know they are seen only as some. I moved among them and watched the hive try, with poor skill, to ignore the fact that something had learned its pulse. The door to the ledger room knew my hand. It warmed beneath the sigil, pious as a doorman who loves his guests too much to warn them about the knives. Inside, stacks rose like the ribs of a fossilized beast. Ink, paper, machines with mouths full of numbers. I touched none of it yet. I stood and let the place organize itself around my attention. Begin, it said, not as an order, but as a resumption, I began. First with the small book The Shipments from the Southern Hoppers. Yesterday, I had corrected a flower of error and left its root to be tugged later. Today, I tugged. The column inverted months ago. The inversion had a parent, a failed maintenance on a pump that should have been replaced 6 emperors since. The failure had a parent, a requisition declined for lack of a stamp. The decliner's hand had a tremor disguised as austerity. The tremor had a cause, fear. The fear had a cause, hunger. Every ledger hides the same ancestor. I wrote, not with haste, but with the exactness of a man told to cut an artery and bind it in one breath. Each stroke narrowed a future where men would starve so that paper might remain faithful to a lie. I crossed out 3 names. I added 1. I rerouted a trickle and turned it into a stream. Somewhere below, a furnace cleared its throat and allowed itself a steadier fire. Dren found me like a shadow that wants to admit it is grateful. He held himself at the distance men choose when they suspect that closeness will cost them belief. You're changing things, he said, not quite accusation. Clarifying, I answered. We have been paying interest on panic. He leaned, drawn against his caution. Who is we? I almost said you and I, but the second heart corrected me with a patience that felt like mercy for a child who has miscounted his fingers. Those who will be changed by what the hands do, I said instead, and watched the phrase settle into him, a seed choosing a bruise as soil. We worked. He asked where to sign. I pointed. He asked whether the numbers would anger the supervisor. I said yes, but the pump would be pleased and the pump's favor mattered more. He laughed despite himself, the laugh of a man who recognizes blasphemy and forgives it when it saves a child. By second bell, the room had learned my name for it. Tool. I touched machines and they obeyed with the docility of animals who have at last been asked to be the thing they are. The puncher stopped jamming when I moved the stool closer, a correction its operators had been forbidden to make because the manual had been written by a man who had never bled on the floor. The tally scribe stylus ceased to skip when I turned the paper 90 degrees so the grain would not lie. Small mercies, which are the only mercies that ever stay. And then the hive blinked. Not outwardly, inwardly. A shutter slid aside somewhere in the architecture of meaning. A bandage came off a wound confident in its infection. I felt it the way a man feels a storm long before the first drop, bones humming the note the sky has chosen. The revelation did not arrive as a new thing. It arrived as the only thing, finally uninterested in hiding. I saw the warp, not as a color or a shape, as a relationship, the way fear moves through a room before its cause enters, the way desire draws circles around objects until the objects wear the grooves like collars, the way prayer trains muscle to carry weight humiliation had already measured. It was not there beside us. It was the predicate we conjugated when we said we. It did not compete with matter. It wrote the rules that made matter pretend to care. The candles at the shrine burned where they should, but the fire's appetite reported to another law, and that law had sent me a messenger and found me willing. I leaned against the desk to steady the body. The eyes wanted to weep, not from holiness, from accountability. Do you understand? It asked, not triumphant, not even curious. Accounting does not care whether the clerk likes the numbers. Enough to be ashamed, I said. Enough to begin. It accepted both. I took the blue book, the one marked casualties. Forecast, a blasphemy bound in calfskin. In it, men were already dead in prose. The bureaucratic poetry of planned losses, percentages of failure given the grace name of acceptable, tables in which children were surplus. I had copied those tables for years. A house scribe making clean the lines of a prophecy he pretended he did not believe. I turned the pages with hands that were now honest. On the 11th page, a row of figures predicted a shortfall at Hopper 12. The recommended response: cut rations on levels 9-11 for 8 days, increase output from Furnace 6 with no additional crew, conscript 20 from the debtor's block to cover injuries. The revelation is not only that the warp feeds, it is that we beautiful monkeys, clever and doomed, do its work for free when we pretend that cruelty is the shortest distance between 2 columns. I crossed out the row, wrote another, rerouted the surplus from a parade 2 weeks hence. loosened the requisition that had been denied because no one wanted to sign under a name that might be audited by a man who had learned to enjoy witnessing. I added one line in red: suspend the Feast of Soot. The city would forgive the lack of spectacle if the soup returned to bowls. If it did not forgive, let it starve with dignity and call it virtue. Dren watched, silent. The supervisor arrived, angry, then confused, then quiet. He did not sign at first. Then he did. Later he would tell himself the decision had been his. I would not correct him. The numbers, like gods, deserve priests who believe they authored their liturgy. Midday's lesser light fell through glass gritty with ash. It made of the ledger room a chapel whose saints were arithmetic. My second heart held steady. The first kept up, proud drummer learning new songs. Outside, the hive tilted. Men looked up from the work that kills them. Not all. Enough to make a rumor. A rumor is a sacrament in the absence of proof. It binds by suggestion where law cannot. I left the book open and went to the window. The glass had been smeared by hands that had not known how to be clean. Through it, the concourse shivered. Pilgrims to the rusted Aquila lit stuttering candles. A servitor paused as if aloud. A child pointed at nothing and laughed at what he could see. And behind it all, like the timbre to which music returns when it remembers its home key, the warp hummed. Not hungry, not satisfied, attentive, as if a vast creature had turned to watch a small tool learn to use itself. Now say what you have learned, it asked, the hand on the shoulder heavier today because the truth deserved weight. I said, we are not separate, we are syntax. You feed on what we are, we shape what you become. The lie is that there are two. The truth is that there is one thing pretending to need witnesses. And your place? It asked. To witness, to work, to be accountable for the hands. It approved. The approval came as a widening of the world at the edges, the corners forgetting their angles so that more could be included without breaking the frame. Revelation does not absolve, it invoice not s. My bill arrived then, a memory I had been allowed to misfile. A night 2 years ago. An extra line in a shipment slate I had pretended was a rounding error. A family moved from level 9 to level 11 because math decided they belonged closer to the dark. They starved more efficiently there. The supervisor congratulated me for the elegance of the solution. I thanked him. I went home and slept. I did not sleep that day. I found the old slate. I wrote the names I could recall. 4. Maybe there had been 6. The brain lies to spare itself. I refused its charity. I wrote 6. I drafted an addendum to today's changes. Ration restoration retroactive. It was a joke the city will not repay what the dead cannot eat. But jokes like that, in red ink, make new habits for living men. When the bell rang to mark a shift's end, I stayed. The supervisor left, rehearsing sentences he would deliver to make himself essential to a machine that had never noticed him. Dren lingered at the door. What happens now? He asked the question we give a friend when we want to say, I will stand where you tell me. Work, I said. And after that, witness. He nodded. The cheap victories of morning become too expensive by dusk. He was not a rich man. He would pay anyway. I closed the ledgers. The room sighed. The machine settled into a rest that was not sleep. I touched the wall and felt the slow petal open of the apparatus within answer, like two matched animals sniffing a gate they both know will open. Outside, the hive wore evening like a penitent wears ash, poorly, proudly. The shrine's few candles refused to be bullied by the wind that had learned to memorize my name. The preacher's boy kept time closer to the braid now. The Medicaid clerk passed me and did not bless himself. He nodded, which is a sacrament when done carefully enough. I looked up. The spires had pierced a sky that had forgotten how to argue. Between them, the air shimmered heat or meaning. I could not say. The warp did not wave like a flag or blaze like a sun. It attended. How much of you do you require to remain? The liturgy returned, faithful to the lesson scaffold. Enough, I said. To repent in public. Good, it answered. And the answer felt like a floor that promises to hold even when the house above it burns. This is the revelation. Not that a god desires you, or that a law binds you, or that a cosmos cares. It is that you may choose once you have been shown whether to align your hands with the hunger that devours or with the work that keeps the next child from being measured as surplus. I chose, not by speech, by arranging the numbers so that fewer men would be spared only by dying. 2 hearts kept time. The night began. The door remembered my hand. Tomorrow, we would write policy in breath and ink. The warp would feed either way. I had learned which flavor it preferred. I would see to it that it acquired a taste for mercy. Dissolution is not erasure. It is arithmetic performed upon the self. Subtraction where pride insists upon sum. Division where vanity demands product. By the time the hive pretended at dawn, the arithmetic had begun to show its remainder. I woke to the sound of my name not as a word, but as an arrangement of duties. The cot yielded me as a sheath yields a blade that knows it will not return the same. My 2 hearts kept the braid. The old drummer no longer feared the new cadence. Between their measures, a silence had learned the discipline of speech. I washed and watched the water practice obedience. Droplets gathered at my jaw and waited for permission to fall. The sigil on my palm did not glow. It rested the way a sealed letter rests, heavy not with wax but with consequence. The salve had nothing left to teach. I closed it and left it closed. Outside, the corridor wore its surveillance lightly. People translated themselves as they passed. Hunger into errands, fear into gossip, hope into small thefts they would repay in stories. I did not judge. I inventory. The lift accepted me and hummed a note that matched the floor's promise to hold. There was still work to do. That is how dissolution begins, with one last list. The ledger room greeted me like an animal taught to trust a hand that has never struck it. Ink waited. Machines idled in the posture of readiness. Dren arrived with eyes that had decided to be brave before they knew why. The supervisor stayed in his office, practicing sentences that would allow him to claim authorship of today's mercies. I opened the blue book, the one that had bound blasphemy in calfskin, and wrote a line I had rehearsed in breath. Suspend the feast of suit indefinite. Redirect surplus to levels 911. Audit hoppers by hand. The hand that wrote those words had been mine yesterday. Mine 10 years ago. Mine in a childhood that had memorized the taste of metal mornings. Today, it was also a hand that knew itself to be temporary. Begin, it said, not command, not permission. Continuation. We began. Reroutes. Releases. A note to the pump men. Your machine will be pleased. You may permit yourselves the same. A memo to the Medicae. Expect fewer crushed hands. Prepare for more men unaccustomed to relief. Small policies are the only ones that ever truly change a city. They travel quickest, hide best, and instruct the world to pretend it always knew them. By second bell, the book had become honest. By third, the room had learned to speak without our mouths. We rested Dren because he is mortal. I because the ledger asked me to look at it as a finished altar. That was when the weight returned. Not the hand on the shoulder before the terrible truth. A hand on the shoulder after, when truth has been told and there is only the work of living with it. It lowered onto the chest with a tenderness I had not earned and a certainty I no longer argued. How much of you do you require to remain? The liturgy asked, dutiful in its mercy. Enough, I said, to leave the room better than I found it. Enough to sign. Then sign, it said. I signed. My name looked smaller than the stroke that followed it, a line that was not flourish, but horizon. When the ink dried, I understood it would outlast whatever shape my mouth kept. I stood. The body felt correct. Correction is gentler than strength. It asks nothing but alignment and keeps everything else honest. Dren watched me with an affection he would later call respect to spare himself embarrassment. You look, he began, and could not decide which sin to choose. Changed, holy, or ill. Finished, I supplied, and the word did not sound like death. It sounded like a tool wiped clean and set where the hand can find it when the next task calls. We left the ledgers open, not in carelessness, but in trust. The room would guard them. The numbers had sworn their small oaths. Outside, the hive wore midday poorly. It prefers twilight, where lies and mercy share the same shade. The shrine's candles had multiplied. Someone, many someones, had decided against spectacle and for soup. A rumor had done the work a proclamation cannot. It had claimed a miracle and, finding none, accepted the mundane kindness of ration restored. The preacher's boy kept time closer to the braid now. His third beat, once late, arrived like a man who has learned what doors are for. I knelt. Thresholds deserve knees. The rusted Aquila did not look at me. I did not ask it to. Between us moved the crowd, the warp's favorite choir. Their prayers rose, their curses sank, and the narrow band between accepted both as taxes paid to weather. "Teach me to end," I whispered, and the whisper did not pretend to be brave. "There is no ending," it answered, without patience, because patience would suggest I had been wrong to ask. "There is work that requires your shape, and work that will require another." "Then teach me to unshape," I said, and the word tasted like iron kept too long under the tongue. The answer arrived as subtraction. First, the voice mine lost its need to carry weight in public. The second timbre that had underpinned my words thinned and stepped aside. Speech became policy again, a tool for those who still needed to be persuaded that mercy is efficient. I let the mouth rest. It had done its accounting. Next, the eyes forgot the pleasure of focusing on what only I could see. The map of attentions that had lit the world dimmed to human fidelity. Depth returned to its place. Distance insisted upon meters rather than meanings. It should have hurt. It relieved. Exhausted sentries are grateful when the wall is manned by others. Hearing followed, closing its unnecessary widths. The low E in the pipe receded. The cough of the furnace became a rumor rather than a hymn. Between sounds, space expanded again, room for other men's thoughts to breathe without sharing my lungs. Smell surrendered last. It had loved its history, its power to name, manufacture, and sin. It let go gently, retaining only what a worker needs. The sour warning of rot, the sweet lie of solvent, the clean humility of water. Inside, the new apparatus, the throat of a bell, the listening flower folded its petals to keep their edges. It did not die. It learned discretion. The second heart slowed and set itself farther back, a patron content to fund anonymously. The old drummer found his original tempo and discovered he had never lacked dignity. I stood, lighter not because I had been emptied, but because the load had been distributed. The city should learn from bodies. Dren found me at the edge of the concourse and did not ask the question men ask when they are terrified kindness will leave. He had decided, finally, to be decent. That is all Revelation asks of its witnesses. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he said, as if I were a shift. "I will come back," I said, which is not the same, and truth should be forgiven when it chooses accuracy over comfort. We walked the artery toward the lifts. The crowd parted for neither of us now. Good. Mercy should look like habit, not miracle. At the door to my level, the boy who had once knocked with rehearsed fear waited, jacket still too big. He had replaced a superstition with a question, and finding it sturdy, carried it like a tool. "Sir," he said, offering a slate with hands that wanted to be steady. "The pump men sent thanks." I took the slate. The note was short. "Men who serve machines do not love flourishes. Less blood today." We noticed. I signed the back and wrote one line. "Notice again tomorrow." The boy smiled, because he had been given a job his mouth could keep safe. Inside the room, the air adjusted to my weight, as if a favorite chair had learned to be a room. The sigils on the wall pulsed once in acknowledgement, then settled into the dignity of finished work. The corner that had unlearned its right angle remembered it for the sake of the next tenant's furniture. "How much of you do you require to remain?" the liturgy asked. For the last time it would need asking. "Enough," I said, "to leave instructions." We wrote them a brief, not in ink, but in posture and policy. Ration first, pageantry last, audit with hands, sign where fear taught you not to, bar 3 windows, open 5. Teach the pump men to pray to pressure rather than to saints who cannot hold a wrench. None of this would ward off catastrophe. It would buy a few more ordinary days, and ordinary days are the only riches the poor can spend without shame. When the instructions were complete, I lay on the floor that had once learned to rise to meet me. The plate's seams hummed a note that matched the room's promise to remember. The second heart came forward not to claim, but to witness. The first kept time, and for one long measure, both drums struck as one. This is how dissolution keeps its dignity, not by vanishing, but by distributing. I felt myself thin across the city into the fist of a woman who would argue at a ration line with courage borrowed from a rumor, into the back of a Medicaid clerk who would refuse a supervisor's order to miscount analgesics, into the stubborn hinge of a door that would hold until the child had passed. The body did not die. It decentralized. The room lost a guest and gained a precedent. I stood. The mirror returned me without argument, smaller than the story, sufficient for the work that remains when a story learns to be useful. I took my coat. It settled like something that had agreed to belong to many shoulders. At the door, I paused. The first night's whisper, soft as a moth's wing brushing the inside of a skull, returned, not as invitation, but as lineage. Do you hear it now, the whisper beneath your skin? Yes, I said, and the voice that answered belonged to the city in the way a river belongs to a map only until flood. And I will teach others to translate. I stepped into the corridor. The door closed behind me with the courtesy doors learn when they have been kept honest. The hive inhaled to sing its long, ugly song, and for once, the note felt almost in tune. Two hearts, mine and the one that had learned discretion, kept time. Work awaited, witness awaited. Dissolution, I discovered, is simply the body learning to be everywhere it is needed, one ordinary mercy at a time.